Hey y'all, it's entry number 37 of this off-season series where we discuss a different player's fantasy value each day as a group. We are another day closer to the start of the 2022 NFL season. Each day we'll drop a name, go through some positives and some concerns of their fantasy profile, and then I'll give my personal opinion at the end. Today's discussion will be on DeAndre Swift, running back, Detroit Lions. The positives with DeAndre Swift, top-tier running back pass catcher. Since entering the NFL, Swift has been one of the better pass-catching backs in the league. During his rookie season, Swift caught 46 passes on 57 targets for 357 receiving yards and 2 receiving touchdowns. He built upon this performance in his second season as he caught 62 passes on 78 targets for 452 receiving yards and 2 receiving touchdowns according to Pro Football Reference. According to Player Profiler, he had the second highest target share and the 5th most routes run among running backs in 2021. Clearly, he gets a lot of usage and puts up solid numbers as a receiver, which makes him more intriguing in fantasy. The next thing I really like about DeAndre Swift's fantasy profile is his elite offensive line. The Detroit Lions offensive line ranked 13th at the end of the 2021 season according to Pro Football Focus. Going into the 2022 season, they will bring back 4 of their 5 starters from 2021. The only change is happening at center as the team goes from Evan Brown to Frank Ragnow, who is one of the better centers in the league, and they are projected to be the 3rd best offensive line in the league according to Pro Football Focus. Having a strong offensive line will make it easier for Swift to put up fantasy points. The last major positive of Swift's fantasy profile is his yards created. DeAndre Swift had an impressive 869 yards created, the 5th best among running backs on the year, and 4.08 yards created per touch, the best among running backs during the 2021 season according to Player Profiler. This wasn't just a one-year thing, as he was the 6th best among running backs in yards created per touch, with 3.4 during the 2020 season according to Player Profiler. Clearly, he's a capable playmaker. Moving on to some of the concerns with DeAndre Swift's fantasy profile. Can he actually stay healthy for 17 games? DeAndre Swift has played in just 13 games in each of the last 2 seasons, about 78.79% of his career. During the 2020 season, his injuries included a hip injury and a concussion, while during the 2021 season, it was an AC joint sprain that impacted his play, according to Player Profiler. As many sports legends have said, the best ability is availability, so if Swift cannot prove that he can stay healthy, it makes it harder to trust him in your fantasy leagues. The next concern I have with DeAndre Swift's fantasy profile is Jamal Williams and the rest of the Lions running backs taking away carries. Swift will dominate the receiving work out of the backfield, but it's still likely to be a running back by committee approach on the ground between Swift and Jamal Williams. In fact, Williams had more carries than Swift during the 2021 season. Williams had 153 carries, Swift had 151. Both played 13 games. This rushing split may put a slight limit on Swift's ceiling compared to some of the other top fantasy backs. The last major concern I have with Swift's fantasy profile is his red zone rushing. In 2021, Swift had 19 carries inside the 20, tied for the 45th most in the NFL, 11 carries inside the 10, tied for the 39th most in the NFL, and just 4 carries inside the 5, tied for the 48th most in the NFL according to Pro Football Reference. If this red zone usage doesn't improve in 2022, it's going to be harder for Swift to put up the touchdown numbers that many of the other top fantasy backs will. Some additional thoughts on Swift's fantasy profile. During the 2021 season, DeAndre Swift finished as the RB23 in standard with 146.9 total fantasy points and 11.3 fantasy points per game. The RB19 in half PPR formats with 177.9 total fantasy points and 13.7 fantasy points per game, and the RB15 in full PPR formats with 208.9 total fantasy points and 16.1 fantasy points per game, according to Fantasy Pros. During the 2021 season, In half PPR formats, DeAndre Swift had 2 out of 13 games with 0 to 5 fantasy points, 3 out of 13 games with 5 to 10 fantasy points, 1 out of 13 games with 10 to 14.9 fantasy points, 3 out of 13 games with 15 to 20 fantasy points, and 4 out of 13 games with 20 to 25 fantasy points according to fantasy data. DeAndre Swift was the RB20 in standard, the RB18 in half PPR, and the RB18 in full PPR in terms of season fantasy points in 2020 according to Fantasy Pros. In 2021, DeAndre Swift had just 40.5% of his yards after contact, averaged 1.7 yards after contact, which was one of the worst marks in the league among running backs according to RotoWire. The Detroit Lions haven't had an 1,000-yard rusher since Reggie Bush in 2013. The Detroit Lions will have a new official offensive coordinator in 2022 with Ben Johnson. Johnson allegedly shared play-calling duties with head coach Dan Campbell towards the end of the 2021 season after they took duties away from former offensive coordinator Anthony Lynn. Personal opinion: DeAndre Swift is currently going off the board as RB9, about pick 17 overall, on ESPN, and RB12 on Yahoo. This is the exact range I have him in as well. The receiving upside and the offensive line are great, but the low red zone usage may put a bit of a cap on his ceiling. I do worry that his ADP will climb a little bit closer to the NFL season, with NFL Hard Knocks covering the Detroit Lions this year. But the bottom line is that Swift should be in the RB1 conversation as long as he's healthy in 2022. For each of these entries, we will highlight a charitable cause or organization. I couldn't find a cause that DeAndre Swift is passionate about in my brief research, so here's a link to his teammate, TJ Hawkinson's My Cause My Cleats in 2021, which was for Warrior Rising. Here's a link to that organization below. And that's it for today's entry. If you enjoyed this entry, be sure to like and subscribe.